is the internet fucking up? Bruh.
The player is able to move side to side whenever he or she pleases, but as this prototype is about feeding animals, the player should be able to take some food and throw it across the scene like a delicious edible frisbee. More specifically, by the end of this lesson, when the user presses the spacebar key, the player will fire a piece of food across the scene. To do this, we'll turn our food object into something called a prefab. Prefab is short for prefabricated, because a prefab is a pre-configured, pre-constructed, prefabricated object that we can reuse in the scene with all of its settings and components ready to go. Our food prefab, for example, will come prefabricated with a high-speed forward velocity so that when we add it to our scene, it automatically goes flying. After we've made our food into a reusable prefab, we'll instantiate it into our scene when the user presses spacebar. Instantiating is just a fancy programming word for making a new copy or clone or instance of an object. So to recap, when the user presses spacebar, we'll instantiate a new food prefab. And to make all that happen, I'll see you in Unity.
Must be at your cranium to even try to aim at this. I can't be a Satanist. I don't know who Satan is. Defy your limits. They thought that I would die, but I survived off spinach. Macho man. Popeye did it, and I know you're looking down, so Popeye did it. The key to my lyric is my physic. Astrophysical. I tap into your spirit. Of course, I'm talking to you. And of course, I'm talking to you. Dude, what the hell? What do you mean? You must be at your cranium to even try to aim at this. I can't be a Satanist. I don't know who Satan is. It's in the goes in rotation, bringing amethyst. Must be at your cranium to even try to amethyst. Aim at this. Amethyst or amethyst, the gemstone. Aim at this. Wordplay. Come on now. What happened? Oh, my phone. My phone just stopped the stream for some reason. I don't know. I don't know why. I don't know why. Stay away. Stay away. We had a great time without you, I bet.
Okay, so we've got some basic interactions set up in our little game now, so we can make our player move back and forth, and they're stuck within the boundary of that invisible wall that we set up for them. So now what we're going to do is we're going to help the player feed some of these animals. So we're going to actually give this little piece of food, our piece of pizza, some forward movement so it can fly across the screen whenever the player throws it. So to do that, we're going to go into our scripts folder, right-click, and create another.
I need to get a third monitor. One for my stream, one for my bullshit, and the other one for my Unity. Guys, you gotta send me $100. Each of you.
Other script. And we're going to name this Move Forward. Now remember, always make sure you name it properly the first time.
Must be out your cranium to even try to amethyst. I'm going back out. I'm getting sleepy. Fuck you, bitch. Fuck you too. I don't want you here anyways.
Forward script.
Fuck you.
And now that we have our script, we're going to drag and drop it onto our piece of pizza. And we'll make sure that it's properly attached. So it's
JKs. I'm JKing.
been added as a component, which is great. Now we're going to open up our script. Now in our IDE, we're going to do something very familiar. We're going to create a new variable, and we'll call it a public. So that way we can change it in case we need to later in the editor. Float speed, and we'll just set this to 40 for now. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go down to our update method so that we can move that piece of pizza forward. So we're going to get the transform component of our current object, which is going to be our food. And then we're going to translate it so that we can move it in the direction that we want it to. And then we're going to open parentheses. Now we're going to move it forward in the direction that it's pointing. And then we're going to make sure that it updates over time instead of updating every single frame. And then we're going to make it move at the speed that we set up in our variable. So now we close that statement and we save our script. Now back in Unity, when we press play, we should see this piece of pizza fly straight through the air. Ooh, and there it goes. It's just flying all the way in the distance. There that pizza goes. Cool. So, to recap what we just did, so we made a move forward script in our scripts folder. We attached that script to our pizza. And then in our IDE, we made a speed variable to control how fast the pizza flies, if we want to make it faster or slower later. And then we wrote a new line of code to be able to move that pizza forward over time at the speed that we wanted to using our translate method. Now it's your turn.
Good luck with what I'm doing. I'm making games right now. For you! So when I put it on my website, you can play them. Dummy. You're welcome for my fucking service. You're all welcome for my fucking service. Fucking ungrateful fucks.
Alright, so we make it so our pizza can fly all the way off into the distance. There it goes. Can we chase it down? Just keeps going on and on forever and ever, all the way until it reaches the ends of the earth. So we're going to stop play mode. Now if we focus back on our main characters here, I'll just do a top-down view for now. Now, our little piece of pizza has the behavior that we want it to have, and now we need to create something called a prefab so that we can keep reusing it anytime, anywhere, and it will always be the exact same, and it'll have everything that it should be doing. In order to do that, we're actually going to create another folder in our assets. Right-click on Assets, Create a Folder, and we're going to name this Prefabs. Now, what we're going to do is, in our prefabs folder, we're actually going to drag now our food from our hierarchy and drop it into the prefabs folder. Actually going to drag now our food from our hierarchy and drop it into the prefabs folder. So now what it's asking is if we would like to create an original or a new variant of this prefab. Now, a prefab is a prefabricated version of the object that you're using. So, for example, because we want to reuse this piece of pizza, we make a prefab so that we can keep reusing the pizza over and over again, and it will always have the move forward script applied to it. Because we changed the size of this pizza, it'll always be this size whenever we bring it from our projects into our project hierarchy. Now, specifically, with our original prefab, we're making a brand new prefab versus a prefab variant where, say, we had a bunch of different kinds of pizzas, but they all, are generally a pizza. Then we would start with a pizza, and then maybe one of the variants has pepperonis on it, one of the variants has vegetables on it, so on and so forth. So variants are really useful if you have a basic prefab that you're going to use, but we're just going to make our own prefab right now. So now that you have an original prefab, you can actually see it looks very similar to some of the other assets that we have. So if we take a look at the humans, you can see they all have this blue cube. So that blue cube actually denotes that these are also prefabs too. For our sake, since we made a new prefab, we added it to our prefabs folder. So, in fact, we have this piece of pizza in the scene, and if we press play, you can see that our piece of pizza flies off into the distance, just like it did before. And in fact, we can actually drag our prefabs into our scene, and they'll always have the same characteristics too. So they have that move forward script that actually makes them fly off into the distance. There they go, never to be seen again. So the way that we'll actually make these pieces of pizza spawn is actually from the player itself. So using our player controller, we can actually throw some of these pizzas by ourselves. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to make sure that the player always has a reference to that piece of pizza. So we're actually going to go into our player controller class, and we'll create a new variable. So this will be a public, so that way we can see it and our class can see it. In this case, it'll be a game object, since instead of a value that we're storing, like a float or an integer, we'll actually be storing objects themselves. And then we'll just name this projectile prefab, so that way we know that it's a prefab that we're going to be throwing later. Now if we save, and we hop back into Unity, now in Unity, when we click on our player, you'll see that under the player controller script, there's now an empty projectile prefab, and there's no game object attached to it. Now what you want to make sure you do is drag over your food prefab into that variable. So then that way it always creates a new food prefab from your prefabs. If you were to take the food that's in your project hierarchy, it would actually constantly be trying to create that piece of food that's already in your scene. And so you can actually break stuff later as you try to create more pieces of pizza. So what you're going to do is you're going to go into your assets, you're going to create a prefabs folder, drag your piece of pizza down into the prefabs folder so you can create an original prefab. And then
You're welcome for my service, Lactasia.
Create a new variable, a public game object projectile prefab.
You're welcome.
Then you're going to save your script. And then in Unity, you're going to open up your player so that you can see all of the components in the inspector.
Check.
And you're going to drag a piece of food that you made from your prefab, drag it out of the prefabs folder and into the projectile prefab variable slot right here. Now it's your turn.
Must be out your cranium to even try to aim at this. I can't be a Satanist. I don't know who's saying this. Defy your limits. They thought that I would die, but I survived off spinach.
So what we're going to do is we need to figure out a way where whenever the player presses a button, very similar to how they press the left or right arrow keys, they move back and forth. Whenever they press a button, they will spawn their own pizza, because we can't just be magically dragging on pizzas if our player's playing the game. It doesn't really work like that, and if 10 people are playing the game, there's only one of you. It's just never going to happen. If we go into our code, now in our IDE, we're actually going to create more logic. So we're going to create another if statement, So if you remember, we used our input manager to actually know when somebody's pressed the left or right key using our get axis. Now, another way that we can actually get input is if we go to our condition and we type in input for our input manager, so that way it knows whenever the player is using a controller or their keyboard, and we press dot. Now there's all of these functions that we can use, like get button up, get button down, useful if you have a controller, the get axis that we used before to see whenever the axis changes, and specifically there are these series of functions called get key down, get key up. And so these are all related to your keyboard keys. So if you get key, it gets whenever the key is pressed. Whenever you use get key down, it's whenever the key is pressed down specifically, and key up is whenever you actually let go of that key, it will do that thing. So in our case, we'll do get key down, so that way it's really instant. So whenever the player presses that key once, it'll fire off one of our projectiles. And what we're going to do is we have some different parameters that we can actually put into this method. So we have key code key, not really sure what that means yet, or we have a string name. Now, the problem is, if I want to use the space bar, I don't really know if the string that I want to use is space or if it's space bar. I'm not entirely sure. I haven't really memorized that. So a really easy way that we can do this is something that Unity and C# already do, which is super convenient. So we're actually going to get our key code. Now key code basically is mapped to any key on your keyboard. You can actually see in the description it says these directly map to a physical key on the keyboard. Super helpful. So what we'll actually do is we'll type in key code, and then we need a dot so that we can find all of the different keys that are underneath key code. And you can see there's a lot of keys that we can press. There's the backspace, there's backslash, there's the letter D, there's an equal sign. So in my case, I actually just want the space bar. So you can see all the way down at S, there's actually the space key, which is really convenient. So now if we close off this parentheses, that way this is all confined within this input method. And then we're just going to add a comment for now in our if statement using the 2 forward slashes. As a to-do for later, we'll launch a projectile from the player. And then we'll save that. So what you're going to do is in your player controller script, you're going to add an if statement so that you can get the space bar whenever it's pressed down. And then you're going to add a comment saying that we'll launch a projectile from the player so then we can add it in later. Now it's your turn. So we've made it so that we can get the player input whenever they press the space bar. So we'll remove this comment and we'll actually code how we can launch a projectile from the player. So now, whenever the space key is pressed down, something will happen. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use a new method. So this one's called instantiate. And so what instantiate does is it's another way of saying that we're going to create an object. But specifically, in our case, instantiate is for creating copies of objects that already exist. So, for example, our projectile prefab that we have at the top, we've already created that. So we're not trying to create brand new projectile prefabs, we're actually just trying to create copies of it. And instantiate is what allows you to create a copy of that object. So if we open the parentheses, you see that it's looking for an object to copy, so we're actually going to do the projectile prefab and autocomplete. And we actually need more options, so if we scroll through the different ways that we can do this, so you see here in particular, this line is really useful. So these parameters are asking for a position that the object is going to start at and the rotation that it should be when you create it. So what we're actually going to do is, since we want this to actually spawn on the player's position, we'll just use their transform position to do that. And then, since we already have a rotation set up on the prefab, we don't need to change it at all because it's only going in one direction. So we'll type in projectile, and then we'll get our projectile prefab. We'll get the transform, because that's where our rotation is stored, and then we'll get the rotation. And then we close that statement, and now, when we save, if we go back into Unity, and now when we press the play button, you can see the piece of pizza flies off to the distance as it did before, and if I click on the game screen, you can see I can move my player back and forth, and as I press spacebar, now I'm creating new pizzas, and those pizzas are flying off into the distance. So, what you're going to do is you're going to go into your player controller. In your script, you're going to add some new lines of code. You're going to create another if statement so that you can see whenever the spacebar is pressed down, we can create a new projectile prefab using the instantiate method and have it start at the player's position and oriented in the direction that we want it to be at. Now it's your turn.
I'm gonna try to remember these. Let me put on some fucking music to kill the dead air. Killing the dead air.
going to add some that the object is going to start at and the rotation that it should be when you create it. So you see here in particular, this line is really useful. So we're not trying to create brand new projectile prefabs, we're actually just trying to create copies of it. And instantiate is what allows you to create a copy of that object. So if we open the parentheses, you see that it's looking for a object to copy, so we're actually going to do the projectile prefab and autocomplete. And we actually need more options, so if we scroll through the different ways that we can do this, so you see here in particular, this line is really useful. So these parameters are asking for a position that the object is going to start at and the rotation that it should be when you create it. So what we're actually going to do is, since we want this to actually spawn on the player's position, we'll just use their transform position to do that. And then, since we already have a rotation set up on the prefab, we don't need to change it at all because it's only going in one direction. So we'll type in projectile, and then we'll get our projectile prefab. We'll get the transform, because that's where our rotation is stored, and then we'll get the rotation. And then we close that statement, and now, when we save, if we go back into Unity, and now when we press the play button, you can see the piece of pizza flies off to the distance, as it did before, and if I click on the game screen, you can see I can move my player back and forth, and as I press spacebar, now I'm creating new pizzas, and those pizzas are flying off into the distance. So, what you're going to do is you're going to go into your player controller, okay, so we made our piece of food into a prefab, so now we can just spawn it whenever we want. But now we should make the animals a prefab because they're actually going to be coming down in the opposite direction. So we're going to turn them into prefabs too. Now, before we make all of these animals into a prefab, it's a lot easier if we edit them and make them the way we want it before we turn them into prefabs. So we're just going to turn all these animals around, and we're going to turn them 180 degrees. So we can actually just do that in our rotation. So because we're rotating them in the opposite direction, we want to rotate them on the Y to 180. That way they turn back around. Same thing with the fox. And finally the moose. So now all of our animals are facing the other direction. Now we also want our animals to move. Luckily, we've already made that script, and there's no point in making that script again because it's just going to do the same thing. The animals are just going to move forward in the direction that they're pointing. So we're going to actually add this script onto these animals. Now, an easy way to do that is to script the animals. There's no point in making that script again because it's just going to do the same thing. The animals are just going to move forward in the direction that they're pointing. So we're going to actually add this script onto these animals. Now, an easy way to do that is if we actually select our moose and we shift click down to, in my case, the doe, you can see that all of the components that they share are already here in the inspector versus some of the other components that aren't the same. What we can do is we can actually just click and drag the move forward script onto the inspector, and it'll apply the move forward script onto all three of these animals. Now, if you don't believe me, if I click on the moose, it has a move forward script. If I click on the fox, it also has a move forward script. And if I
Nice.
click on the dough, there's a move forward script as well. Now, we don't want all of these animals running at the same speed, so we're gonna fix this just a little bit. I think because the moose is a little bit bigger, we'll make it faster. So that way it's a little bit more typical for the player to throw the food at it. The fox is a bit smaller, so we'll make it slower. Maybe to like 5. And then the dough, we'll set this one to 10 since it's in the middle. And now, if I position myself behind all these animals, we should see, in both the scene and the game view, all of them running at different speeds. Cool, there they go. Off to the races.
Where do you set the moose at?
And then the dough. The fox is a bit smaller, so we'll make it bigger. Now, we don't want all of these animals running at this. Is a little bit bigger. We'll make it faster. So that way it's a little bit more typical for the player to throw the food at it. The fox is a bit smaller, so we'll make it slower. Maybe to like 5. And then the dough. We'll set this one to 10 since it's in the middle.
Okay, so it's the same.
And now, if I position myself behind all these animals, we should see in... Cool, there they go. Off to the races. On a piece of pizza. Once again, flying off into the distance. So, now our animals are moving forward just like our pizza is, which is awesome. So, we're now going to go and create all of these animals and turn them into prefabs as well. Now, to turn all of these animals into prefabs, what we're going to do is we're going to take our moose, drag it into our prefabs folder, make sure it drops right in there. We're going to make an original prefab. Same thing with our fox. And then with our dough. Now you can see all of these animals are prefabs. And the cool thing is, even though they all share the move forward script, because the move forward script itself is unique on each object, they're able to have all these different speeds. So the pizza can be at 40, the moose can be at 15, the fox can be at 5, and the dough can be at 10, because each of these is just unique to that individual animal. And in our prefabs, if we actually go to open prefab on the right, you'll see that these values were saved when we turn them into prefab, which is super helpful. If we go back to our scene view, we'll click this little arrow next to the animal dough, which will bring back to our scene view. And now, to really test to make sure that this works, we're actually going to remove all of our animals from our project hierarchy, so they remove from the scene. And now, when we press play, as we drag all of the different animals onto the scene, you can see that they start moving on their own. And now we can drag as many as we want. It's like a little army of animals marching off into the distance as the pizza flies away. Start moving. And now, when we press play, as we drag all of the different animals onto the scene, you can see that they start moving on their own. into the distance. Pizza flies away. So, now what you're going to do is you're going to go into each of your animal objects, and you're going to turn them all 180 degrees, and then you're going to add the move forward script into their components, into each one, and then you're going to change each of their speed values to be different, and then finally you're going to drag all the animals into your prefabs folder. That way they'll turn into prefabs, and then we can use them later for whatever we need. Now it's your turn. So we've made some really good progress. We've made all of our objects in our scene able to move. So we have that pizza that flies off into the distance. We have the animals that are marching off into the ends of the world. And then we have our player here, and if I go to the game screen, you can move them back and forth. And one of the problems that we have is we have all of these things that are able to march off into eternity, and we can even generate all of these different pizzas, and this is actually going to cause a huge problem for our game later down the line, as we have all of these different objects in our scene that are constantly flying away, constantly being updated. You can even see all of the pieces of pizza flying away. Our animals are still marching along, so they never actually disappear from the game itself. So in order to do that, we actually need to create a way to remove them from our game when we don't actually see them in what the player should see. How we're going to do that is by creating another script to be able to manage that interaction. So we're going to go into our scripts folder and right click, create a C# script, and we're going to call this script Destroy Out of Bounds. Definitely a very long script, but make sure that it's named properly. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take Destroy Out of Bounds, and we're going to add this script onto our piece of pizza in the scene. And then if we click on the pizza, just make sure that it's attached. Perfect. Now if we open the Destroy Out of Bounds script, and then if we click on the pizza, just make sure that it's take Destroy Out of Bounds, and we're going to add this script onto our piece of pizza in the scene. And then if we click on the pizza, just make sure that it's attached. Perfect. Now, if we open the Destroy Out of Bounds script, now we're going to use an if statement to check whenever our piece of food flies out of the bounds of what we can see on our game screen, it'll delete that object from the game. So, if we use an if statement, and we'll leave the conditions for now, and then we use those curly braces. So, we want to get the current object's position. So we'll do the transform to get that, and then get their position. And since everything is happening on the z-axis, we'll get the z of our piece of food, and if our food flies greater than, let's say 50 for now, there's a really helpful method that we can use in C# called destroy. Now destroy actually enables us to remove a game object, we can remove components, we can remove assets, and so we'll use destroy to remove the game objects on the screen that are no longer actually within view of our player. In this case, since we're actually calling the object itself, we can just use lowercase g, game object, and this will be the current game object that this script is applied to. So now when we save, we go into Unity, and let's position our camera a bit better to see where the pizzas disappear. So when we press play, we watch the pizza flies off into the screen, and then it deletes right about there. So we can probably make it a little bit less. So we'll set this to, let's call it 30, and in fact we're just going to make a variable for this just in case we need it for later. So we'll call it private, since we know just about the size that we need it to be. This will be a float, and this will be our top boundary, so top bound, and then we'll just say 30. to our top bound. And save. Back in Unity, you can watch the pizza. And when they fly to the top boundary, you can even expand the game scene. Oh, that's weird. I think we broke something. You still see the pizzas flying off. That's strange. That didn't work. Well, remember when we made prefabs? So we created this prefab on this pizza, and we have the destroy out of bounds script. However, adding the script to this object in the scene doesn't actually update all of the prefabs. In order to do that, there's actually a little button over in the top right of our inspector called Overrides. And if we left click Overrides, you can see that it actually tells you that something's different between this piece of pizza in the scene and our prefab itself. And so the destroy out of bounds script is actually new. So if we apply this, now all the pizzas that we create when we instantiate them should have that script applied. So one more time. Pizza flies off, disappears, more pizzas, and they all disappear. So, perfect. Now we don't have a million pizzas flying off into the distance. So, now what you're going to do to be able to destroy all of these pizzas in the scene is you're going to create a new script called destroy out of bounds, and then you're going to apply the destroy out of bounds script onto your piece of food, and then going into your IDE, on the destroy out of bounds script, you're going to set a variable for the top boundary, and then in your update function, you're actually going to use an if statement to see whenever the piece of food flies out of the boundary, you're going to destroy that game object or that piece of food. And then, in Unity, you're going to make sure that you go to your piece of food, click Overrides on the right side, and then make sure that you apply your override to make sure that all the prefabs you create all have this script attached. Now it's your turn.
My blisters.
So, we've made it so that when a piece of pizza flies off the screen, it gets removed. And the same thing if we launch a whole bunch of other pizzas, so they don't just fly off into the distance. However, if we take a look at our animals, they're still able to go all the way off to the ends of the world. So, we're going to fix that really quick. What we're going to do is we're going to apply our destroy out of bounds script to all of our animals. So if we click on the first animal and then shift click to highlight all of them, then we can just click and drag our destroy out of bounds script and drop it on. So now they all have destroy out of bounds applied. However, destroy out of bounds only really works right now for the pizza whenever it goes to the top boundary. We want it so that when the animals get down to the bottom, they get removed. So in our script, we're going to add another variable. This variable we'll call lower bound, so it'll be very similar, private float lower bound, and we'll set this to about -10 just so it's under the player. And now we're going to use a new programming concept called else if. So very similar to if statements, but something that you actually add onto the end of an if statement. So if I type else if, and then we do parentheses for whatever condition we want to happen, and we do curly brackets, and we press enter. So the way you would read this is, if this thing happens, then it'll do this. Else, if this thing happens, it'll do this thing instead. And so then this way you can cascade different things that you want to happen in case there are unique conditions you're trying to fulfill. fulfilled. So in our else if statement, we're going to find the position of our animal. So our transform.position .z, and if this position is ever less than our lower bound this time, then we're going to destroy the game object instead. Cool. Close that. So now if we save this, and then we go into Unity, now if we look below the player, when we press play, when the animals move down past the player, they actually get destroyed from the scene. Exactly what we want to happen. So now what you're going to do in your destroy out of bounds script, you're going to add your own variable for the lower boundary and set it to -10. You're going to use an else if statement after your if statement. So in case the animal goes past the lower bounds, it'll destroy that game object. And then in Unity, you're going to make sure that you add the destroy out of bounds script onto each of the different animals. And then you're going to make sure that you override all of their prefabs, so that way it applies all of the scripts onto the animal prefabs. Now it's your turn. Everything we've done up to this point has been very orderly, very predictable. User presses left and right, player moves left and right, user presses spacebar, player fires a projectile. So it's about time we shake things up, making it more challenging for the player by introducing a little randomness into this project. I'm talking about random animals spawning at random locations. Essentially, an animal surprise party. By the end of this lesson, random animals will spawn at a random location at the top of the screen, stampeding towards the player. In order to randomly select one of our animal prefabs, we're first going to store those animals in an array. An array is essentially a numbered list of objects starting at 0, and the great thing about arrays is it's super easy to select if we want object 0, 1, 2, and so on. But we don't want to choose which animals get selected, we want it to be random. So we'll use the random.range method to generate a random index number between 0 and 2. Will it be a moose, a deer, a fox? Who knows? Only random.range does. Since random.range has been so helpful for us in selecting animals, we'll also use it to randomly generate spawn positions. Then our animals start spawning on the left, in the middle, on the left again, the right, you get the idea. So, to make all that happen, I'll see you in Unity. Awesome, so our project's in a really good place right now. You can see when we play our game, as our food and as our animals leave the scene and leave the player's view, they get removed. Same thing whenever we create these pizzas on our own. Now, one of the things that we have to fix is we need to be able to make animals spawn in our scene, and we need to be able to make it do randomly, so that way it's a little bit more challenging. So we're actually going to use some code to be able to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our project hierarchy on the right side. We're going to right click in the hierarchy and we're going to create empty. Now we've created an empty game object, and we'll use this game object to actually store our script. We're going to actually call this game object our spawn manager, because this is what we'll be using to actually manage all the spawning of all of these animals on the screen. Now we're going to need an actual script to be able to spawn all of these animals in random locations in our scene. So in our scripts folder, we're going to right click on it, and we're going to create a C# script. And we're going to call this script our spawn manager. Now we're going to attach our spawn manager script to our spawn manager game object. So if we click on the spawn manager, you can see that we've now attached the script to it. You can see where our spawn manager is in our scene, right in the center. It's invisible because it doesn't actually exist, so you can't see it on the player screen, but we know it's there, and that's how we'll be making all these animals spawn. So if we double click on spawn manager, now our spawn manager script opens up in our IDE, and what we're going to do is create a new variable. Now, just to see what this game object does, we'll make it public for now. And we'll make this a game object because it's supposed to store our animal. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to use something called an array to store all of the different animals that we have. Now, the way that you would use an array when you're programming is you would actually use our square brackets. So instead of pressing shift to create those curly brackets that we would use in all of our statements, instead we're just going to press these square brackets, and these two side by side means that we've created an array. Now an array in programming is something that you can use to store multiple objects, multiple variables inside of it. So say we had something like a bookshelf, and we had 4 different shelves, and so those shelves we would use to store all of our books onto. We'll call this array animal prefabs, so that way this array stores all of our animal prefabs that we've created. Now the way that you would read this line is that we have a public game object array of animal prefabs, or an array of game objects which we'll call animal prefabs. An easier way to see this is if we actually go back into Unity after we save. Now in Unity you can see that we've created this public game object in our script, and if we go to our spawn manager, underneath spawn manager you can see this animal prefabs drop down. So if we expand it, now you can see that's asking us for our size. So this is the number of items that we actually want to store in our array. So for example, say we want to store 4 items. It'll ask us what 4 things we want to store. All of these different elements are all of the different boxes that we can put our game objects in. If I were to change this to something like 3, in Unity, it would actually change the size of our array as we need it. Because we only have 3 animal prefabs, we only need to make the array a size of 3, so then that way our array can store 3 different game objects. So what we'll do is we'll left click and drag each of our prefabs into one of those element boxes. And now all of the animals are stored in this array that we have in our spawn manager script. So what you're going to do is you're going to create an empty game object yourself called spawn manager. And then you're going to go create another script called spawn manager, and then in your IDE, under the spawn manager script, you're going to create your own variable called game object, and you're going to use these 2 square brackets to be able to create an array, and we're going to call that array animal prefabs. And then back in Unity, you're going to go to your spawn manager, open up the spawn manager script, expand the animal prefabs dropdown, change the size to 3, and then you're going to drag your prefabs from your project window into each of these boxes for each element. Now it's your turn. Alright, so we've created our spawn manager and given our spawn manager an array so that we can hold each of our different animal prefabs. But that doesn't really do us any good because we can't actually spawn anything now. So we're going to create something in our code so that we can actually spawn these animals. Going into our IDE, inside of our update method, we're going to use an if statement like we did before to create all of the different pieces of food that we were throwing into our scene. And we're actually going to use a key code to be able to spawn all of those animals. So if we use our input manager, we're going to get the key down for when our player presses a key. And this time we're going to use another key code. And we're just going to use S on our keyboard because we're not going to use that to move right now. And then if we type our curly brace and press enter. So now that we've created a way to actually get player input to be able to spawn these animals, we now need to actually spawn these animals. So we're going to use the instantiate method that we use to be able to create all of our different pieces of food. And we're actually going to use our animal prefabs array. Now, in Unity, the way that we're going to pull each of the different elements from our array of animal prefabs are animal. So, we're going to use the instantiate method that we use to be able to create all of our different pieces of food. And we're actually going to use our animal prefabs array. Now, in Unity, the way that we're going to pull each of the different elements from our array of animal prefabs is actually using these elements over on the side here. So you can see element 0 is the animal doe, element 1 is our fox, and element 2 is our moose. So in our code, each one of those numbers is actually how we can call each of those different animals. So, for example, if I use 0, this should give us our doe. And now, we're going to need a place to actually create this animal. So in our case, we're just going to spawn the animal just above the screen that the player can see. So using a vector 3 for our position. We don't need it to be anywhere on the X. We don't need it to be flying in the air on the Y. And since our top bound was set to 30, we'll just spawn the animals at 20 for now. And we need to make sure that the rotation of those animals is properly set up, so we'll use our animal prefabs again. Use those square brackets, and we'll use 0 for now, and then we'll get the rotation of that animal. So if we save, and we go into Unity, set. save, and we go into Unity. So, our doe is element 0, and when we press play, and we press the S key, you can see that a doe spawns every single time. So, in our code, to make this a bit easier to control and so that we don't have to keep using this 0 every time, we're going to make a new variable, and we'll call it public for now so that we can interact with it in Unity. Now, in this case, we're actually going to make this number an integer because it has to be a whole number. If we actually try to use a float, then our array will get very angry at us. And we'll call this the animal index. Now, in an array, each each of these different numbers is actually called the index, and so in this case, because we didn't assign this a value, it'll just be 0. So we can just remove the zeros. And then if we save, now in Unity, you can see that. And then if we save, now in Unity, you can see that we have a
auto reordering to have the PPE you need on.
our animal index here. So when we press play, whenever we press the S key, you can see that does spawn in the scene. If we change our animal index to 1, have our animal index here. So when we press play, whenever we press the S key,
Oh shoot. I know what I did wrong. Okay.
see that does spawn in the scene. If we change our animal index to 1, and we press S now, we have these foxes that spawn. And when we change our index to 2, it'll be pulling from element 2, so we should have mooses that spawn. Now we have a whole herd of moose going down the screen. One thing to note is if we make the animal index 3, and now if we press S, you can see all the way at the bottom of the screen that we're actually getting an error. You can tell it's an error because it's got this big red exclamation point and all the text is red. And this is telling us that the index was outside the bounds of our array. Now because we don't have an element 3, and we're trying to get an element 3, our array doesn't like that. However, if we put this back to 2, and now if we spawn animals, it works perfectly fine. So always make sure that you keep your index inside the size of your array to call the proper element. So, now what you're going to do is in your spawn manager script, you're going to create another variable for the animal index so that we can find each of the different elements in our array. And then in our update method, you're going to create an if statement to get the key down whenever the player presses the S key. And when they do that, you're going to use the instantiate method to create an animal prefab using the selected animal index. You're going to spawn it at 0, 0, 20, and then you're just going to make sure that the rotation of the animal is the same. And then in Unity, to test it out, you're going to go into play mode, and then when you press S, you should see animals spawn. And if you change the animal index to 0, 1, or 2, then you'll see different animals spawn. So, now it's your turn. So we've made it so that we can choose one of the different animals to spawn from our spawn manager by using the index to select one of the animals in our array. Now, there's a better way to do this to be able to randomly select an animal that we need so that it can choose an animal without us telling it which animal we want. Now, what we're going to do is we're actually going to use another method in Unity called random. Now, before we get into randomly selecting which animal that we want to choose, we're actually going to rearrange our code to make it a lot more structured and organized. So, in the past, we've always put our variables at the top of our scripts. What we're actually going to do is we're going to take our animal index, and if we cut it with Control or Command X, and we go into our if statement and create a new line, and then we paste that line of code. Now you can see that our animal index is down inside of our method. You can actually remove this public, Now, where you put your variables in your script matters a lot. Typically, if you have a variable that you're going to use throughout your code, you should actually put it outside of any method, so that way I can actually use the animal prefabs down here in update, or I could use animal prefabs here in start if I wanted to. We've moved our animal index down into our update method. So, the animal index variable can only be seen within this method. In fact, if we try to type in animal index into our start, our method has no idea of what we're talking about because it doesn't exist. Versus if we type in our animal prefabs, you can see that it auto-completes for our prefabs. So now, in our animal index variable is where we'll be selecting a random number that we can then use to select a different animal prefab from our array. Now, we're going to use something called random, which is a class used to generate random numbers, and we're going to use a method called range. And so this will pull a number between the first number that we select and the last number that we select. So in our case, the number that we want it to start at is 0 for the first element of our array, and then we're going to set it to 3. Now, it's important that it's set to 3 because it will actually count through 0, 1, and 2, but it won't use 3. The 3 is what we call an exclusive number, and so it won't actually use that number, but it will use it as the maximum number that it will go up to. So now if we save this, and if we go into Unity, and we press play, now whenever I press S, a random animal should spawn between the 3 different animals we have. So, now that we know that that works in our spawn manager script, we can actually clean this up a little bit. A really cool feature of arrays is that it can actually track the length of how large it is itself. So, if we type animal prefabs for our array, and we type dot, we can get the length of the array. And since the length of our array is a total of 3 elements, it'll actually set it to 3 itself. So if we save once again, in Unity, when we press S, different animals will spawn using our random range. So, we're going to take our public integer animal index and move it down into our update method. And then in that update method, you're going to take the animal index and pull a random range between 0 and our length of our array, which will be 3. And so that way, whenever we press the S key on our keyboard, it will spawn one of the 3 different animals in our array. Now it's your turn.
Ugh.
Alright, so we've made it so that we can spawn all of these random animals, which is awesome. The problem is that they're all just spawning in the same place, and that's definitely not what we want to happen, so we're going to use random again to move them around our scene. Now, to get our animals to spawn in random places, we're going to go down into our update method, where we actually set the position of where we want them to spawn. Now, for the 0, because we don't just want them to spawn in the same place on their x-axis the entire time, we're going to use a random range here. And for now, we'll just set it to be between like -20 and 20. That way it has a wide area of which it can spawn all the animals. Now if I save this and I go into Unity, when I play my game, now whenever I press S, you can see that all of the random go into Unity area of which it can spawn all the animals. Now if I save this and
That's good. I like that.
which it can spawn all the animals. Now if I save this and I go into Unity, when I play my game, now whenever I press S, you can see that all of the random animals are now spawning in random positions, which is awesome. That's exactly what we want. Now, our instantiate method is getting a little bit messy down here. You can see that we have our animal prefabs array, but then we have this huge line of code right here. So we're actually going to create another variable inside of this method for this. So underneath our animal index, we'll create a vector3 variable, since we're trying to store a coordinate. And we're going to call this the spawn position, or spawn pause. And in here, we're actually going to just take this entire line for our vector3 that we generated randomly. We're going to cut that with Control or Command X. We'll paste that into our spawn position. And then we'll replace what was there with our new spawn position. And so now we're just using a variable to be able to store this line of code right here. something that we can do better is we're reusing these numbers a lot here. And so we know that in our random range, this -20 and this 20 is the range of our x that our animals can spawn at. So we'll create a variable, private, float, so that we can get very precise numbers that animals can spawn at. We'll call this our spawn range for the x, and we'll just set this to 20. And then we can remove this -20 and 20 to be spawn range x.
Nice.
And then since we know that in our spawn position that we're always going to be spawning things at 20 on our z, we can just make another variable for that. And then we'll remove this 20. And so now we can use variables to make our code a lot more readable and make our lives a little bit easier, especially if we ever want to change our x values or if we want to change our z value to make maybe spawn a little bit higher. Now we can easily do that and we don't have to change all of these numbers all at the same time. So now it's your turn. You're going to create two new private float variables for the range of the x and the position of the z that animals will spawn at. And we'll set both of those to 20 for now. And then down in our if statement of our update method, we'll create a new vector3 spawn position variable, which will use our random position that we were generating down in our instantiate method. So we're just going to cut all of that out and paste it here. Change the -20 and 20 to negative spawn range x and spawn range x. Change the 20 for the z position to spawn position z. And then use spawn position where we were using our new vector3 with the random range. Now it's your turn.
Alright guys, I gotta go to bed. So I'm just gonna be making games and posting it on my website and among other things. So let me show you real quick. So as you can see, this is my little website right here. Still making shit. But there's going to be a bunch of stuff on it. Stuff I've read for history and philosophers. My music I'm going to post right here as well. Some math and science shit down here. And my artwork is going to be the page for that. And this is where the music files are. But yeah, pretty good, pretty good. Alright, bye, I gotta go to bed. So good night, everybody. Sleep tight.